In this demonstration, I'm going to show you a bit about how to work with data frames and map projections in ArcMap. Alright, so we're going to start with a new empty map document, and you'll notice that I have one data frame at the top of my list here in the table of contents just called layers. So one of the first things that if you don't do this, you should get in the habit of doing is you can rename these, especially if you're going to have multiple data frames. So let's say I'm going to have a map of Canada in one data frame, so I'll name that to Canada, and then I'm going to insert a second data frame, and I'm going to rename that for Ontario. Okay, so there's nothing in these yet, of course, but I'm going to have two different data frames on my layout. If I go to the layout view, you should notice that I've got one data frame called Ontario and another data frame called Canada. And I can move these around and work with them whatever way that I want. I can change, in this case, let's change the page setup so that it's going to be portrait, just for fun. So we'll do this, and we'll just move this up here and say that that's going to be for Canada. I'm not going to do this very precisely. I'm just trying to show you how this works. So when you have multiple data frames, one of the reasons it's nice to be able to name them is it's easy to keep track of which one is which, right? So we've got Canada and Ontario here. So you'll notice that Ontario is highlighted in bold in the table of contents. That's because that's the activated data frame. ArcMap can only really work with one data frame at a time, and so the one that you're working with is the one that's known as being activated. So you can add data to each one, but if you want to work with it, you have to activate it first. So let's go back to Canada, and we will add some data to that. But in order to be able to see it in the data view, I have to activate it. So I just right-click on Canada and say Activate. And now if I go back to the data view, whatever data I add to the Canada data frame is what I will see in the data view. This will make more sense as we go along here. So if I add Canada, and I'll add the graticule here. I add these in. So this is the graticule for the whole world. This is the data just for Canada. I can zoom in to Canada. I just clicked the Alt button and then clicked on the layer that I wanted to zoom to. That's a nice little keyboard shortcut that's good to know. So now I have a data frame with Canada and the graticule here. And of course I could change the symbology and do lots of things here. I'll just very quickly do this just to make it a little easier to look at. Let's just change that to nothing. Okay, so a little more subtle, and I can do the same thing with my graticule. Let's just change that to sort of a light, maybe slightly darker gray. And remember that we like to, unless you really need it in front of the landmass, it's good to put it behind to create the figure ground effect. Okay, so that's in my one data frame, and if I go back to the layout view, you can now see that I've got that displayed in my upper data frame. If I want to switch to the Ontario data frame, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my data view, and of course this is only showing me what's in the Canada data frame. If I want to add data and see it for Ontario, I just have to activate that data frame. And now I can add data for, let's say, the Greater Toronto Area, like so. Okay? So now, when I look at my data or layout view, I can see both data frames. They both have data layers in them. I can independently change the scale of each one, the projection of each one. So for example, for the GTA, I can set that to, let's just say 1 million, just to show you how that works. And so that's changing the scale for that one. And what I can also do, which of course is important in relation to this topic, is change the projection. So I'm going to go to the properties, coordinate system, and change it to a projected coordinate system. In this case, for Canada, we'll use the equal area, Canada-Albers equal area conic. Say OK. Now what this is doing, this warning, which comes up all the time and you get used to seeing, is what this is basically saying is that the data are stored in a geographic coordinate system with no projection, but you're asking it to display it with a projection. So it's saying, you know, this isn't the way this data was stored, this isn't the way it's meant to be shown, are you sure you want to do this? And in this case I can say yes, because I'm just going to look at it. And so now I've got a much nicer projection using a conic developable surface for Canada. And then I can now zoom in my upper data frame to Canada. I can pick a nice round number for that, let's say 55 million. And so now I've got something decent for my upper data frame. I can do the same thing for the lower data frame. I can choose the properties for that, and you'll notice that I don't have to, whoops, that's for the layer. If I do it for the data frame, I don't have to activate the data frame in order to change the coordinate system. So here I'm going to use something more appropriate for a city or a region like UTM NAD83, zone 17. I get the same warning again, that's fine. And so now I can have a different scale and a different projection for each map in my layout. The last thing I'm going to show you here is that you can create an extent rectangle. So if I want to show on my map of Canada the extent of the area that's on my map of the GTA, that's pretty easy to do. I go to the Canada data frame, select properties, and you'll notice that there is a tab called extent indicators. And you can choose another data frame, and again, this is another good reason why it's useful to name your data frames so you can keep track of them. And if I add this to the list on the right, I now have, and I'll just say OK, and again it's telling me, you know, that I'm using a different coordinate system. For now I'm just going to say that's OK. And so you'll see that there's now a red extent rectangle that tells me which part of Canada the GTA is in, and I can zoom in on that layout here to get a better look at it. And I'm zooming in on the layout, not on the actual data. So one more tip is that you can change the look of that extent, and you know, I might obviously set this up a little differently if I was doing this for final production. But if I go back to my properties, I can select that extent indicator, and you'll notice that there's options down here for the frame. So I can change the thickness of that frame. I might want to make it a little thinner. I can change the color of that frame, so maybe something a little more subtle, like sort of a dark gray, and say OK. And you can play around with that depending on what the look is that you're going for, but just one suggestion, as with all things in GIS, is don't just always go with the default, which is this thick red line. Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not. So if I zoom back out now, you can see that I have two data frames, two different projections and scales, and I've created an extent indicator in one map that shows the extent that exists in the second map.